Well, this week's session on growing together with Christ, I want to talk to you from Matthew chapter 10 and verses 1 through 4. And the subject matter is how Christ, or the men chosen to be apostles, and why. The men chosen to be apostles and why. We discussed last week about how Christ in chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, challenged us to be believers that pray for laborers, because the harvest is great, and we need to pray, therefore, the Lord of the harvest, that He will send forth laborers into His harvest. So, the first 9 chapters of Matthew, we see Christ in His ministry by Himself, doing everything by Himself. But now in chapter 10, we see Christ enlisting the help of others. So as Jesus is compelling His followers to be praying for laborers, He is now calling them to be laborers themselves. And while we must be believers that pray for lost souls to be converted, and for God to call laborers, we must also be about the job of laboring ourselves. John MacArthur said this in his commentary on Matthew chapter 10. The believer who prays for God to send workers but is unwilling to go himself prays insincerely and hypocritically. Up until chapter 10, Christ is going about His ministry alone, and now He is employing and enlisting the help of His devoted followers. So the first thing we see in chapter 1 of chapter 10, or verse 1 of chapter 10, we see the installation of the 12, where it says, and when He had called unto Him His 12 disciples. The New American Standard uses the word summoned. He summoned them. In other words, He called them to Himself to confront them face to face. As Christ trained these 12, there were 4 phases. Number 1, they were converted. They trusted Christ. They were called by Christ. They were trained. In other words, they had an internship with Christ for 3 years. They watched, they listened, they observed, they learned, and many times they misunderstood Jesus. And then, after the death and burial and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, they went into their ministry. See, their calling was not based upon their worthiness or capabilities. It was based upon what Christ could do in them and how He could use them. They were chosen by God in His sovereignty. They were chosen after much prayer. They were chosen with preparing them in mind, and they were chosen to be sent out. I like what my friend and fellow elder, Pastor Ken Andrews, says. He says that I am saved to serve. And let me add another S to that. Not only are we saved to serve, but we were also saved to be sent. We were saved to serve and to be sent out. Here's the question that I have for you, believer in Christ. Are you going? Are you willing to go? And then there's the influence of the 12. They were granted power by Christ. The very same thing that Christ did on earth was the very same thing that the apostles did while on earth. And I love how they are described in Acts chapter 17 and verse 6, that they were men that have turned the world upside down. May it be said about us. May it be said about the churches that you attend. I gave that challenge to my church this past Sunday, that may it be said about Lighthouse Baptist Church, that we be a church that turns the town of Hope Mills upside down for Christ. But let me give you a quick summary of these 12. Number 1, there was Simon Peter. He was a fisherman. He was loud. He was obnoxious. He was a spokesman of the 12. He was a great leader of the church. Then there was Andrew. He was a fisherman. He was a former follower of John the Baptist. He was a brother of Simon Peter. There's James. He was a fisherman. Came from a very predominant family. Had a very wealthy background. John was the brother of James. Philip He was one of the first followers of Christ. He brought his brother Nathaniel to Christ. There's Nathaniel. We also know as Bartholomew. Very little is known except for his honesty that was pointed out to him by Christ. There was Matthew, who was a despicable human being. He was a publican, a tax collector by trade, had a dramatic conversion. Thomas. How do we know Thomas? We know him as the doubting Thomas, known for his extremism. James the Less, known for being obscure. Simon Zelotes, we could also call him Simon the Zealot. Prior to conversion, he was a terrorist. Thaddeus, known as Jude, he possessed a childlike, innocent faith. Many believe that he was possibly the author of the book of Jude. And Judas Iscariot, yes, he was chosen by Christ. It was in his sovereignty that he was chosen to be part of the 12, but enough is said about him at this time. Let me give you 3 applications. None of these men, these 12 that I just described to you, exhibited great, extraordinary gifts or talents. They were not from the religious establishment. They were all ordinary men, but they were chosen to do extraordinary things for God. They were all chosen by God. They were all used to help begin to fan the flames of the gospel that is still being flamed today. Do you consider yourself an ordinary human being? Do you consider yourself to be an ordinary Christian? Do you consider yourself to be one that doesn't have the great degrees that others have? Or maybe you're a pastor here watching this, and maybe you have not been to the major colleges, the major degrees. Maybe you don't even have a high school education. But you know something? God can and will do something extraordinary with you. But you have to be willing. You have to be able to want to be used. You just say, God, use me. Whatever little I got, use me. Just like that old gospel song that says, little is much when God is in it. Put your little bit in the hands of God and let Him, watch Him do something great with your little by making it much. God bless you. Hope this was an encouragement to you, and we will see you next time on Growing Together with Christ.